And Peter is director of the Rocky Mountain Tree Ring Research, which is a nonprofit corporation that he founded about 18 years ago. So his research involves use of tree ring data to reconstruct fire, forest, and forest management and climate change, and then apply those things to contemporary natural resource management. And he's been working in the US, Mexico, Mongolia, China, and India. So Peter.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk about this. So what I want to do is give a little bit of background. I mean, the talks yesterday, today, in most cases, I mean, everybody kind of references, okay, this is the way it was, this is the way it is. So what I want to do is give everybody, and probably for a lot of you, this is going to be more or less review of things that you've already heard about, but just some of just some examples of using tree ring data in particular to provide that why we need to do restoration. Restoration itself implies that we have some idea of what we're restoring to and why it's important. So that's the kind of the background on what I want to present today. And I'll give you some examples, and particularly talk about an example moving out of Utah but into the Front Range, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project that we've been working on there. But to start with is just, this concept of historical range of variability. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. I love this paper, this quote from Peter Landris's paper, but gives you the sort of the gist of everything is the spatial and temporal variation is very important. We're not talking about means, we're talking about variation. It's right there in the title. So the range of variation of fire, climate, ecosystem dynamics, and so on, they were relatively unaffected by people. Now, this is one important point. Obviously, Native Americans at certain places, certain times, particularly in terms of an ignition source, were very important in particularly fire regimes. In most cases, we really don't know how important they could have been. Lightning obviously is around and so on. But certainly the Native American populations in general never had the impact that once Euro-Asian settlement takes place in the late 1800s in most areas of the western U.S., logging, grazing, fire exclusion, climate change in more recent decades has had on ecosystem dynamics. I also really like this quote from Pickett et al. In a 1992 paper, but just, ecosystems change. I mean, change is the only constants in ecosystems. They're always changing on all sorts of timescales: succession, climate change, dynamics, wildlife habitats, so on. Everything changes in an ecosystem, but they have limits to those changes, and that's the point of this HRV assessments that we do. This development of HRV is trying to understand what are the sort of boundary changes that natural ecosystems have, and how we might be exceeding those boundaries in current management or current mismanagement of ecosystems. This is just sort of my little cartoon on this, is basically, I mean, the idea is we've got, historical conditions, we're contrasting those with current conditions to get to desired conditions. We can ask a couple of questions at this point. So compared to our historical conditions, these, again, sort of evolutionary, longer-term dynamics that have gone on ecosystems, are our current conditions sustainable? Are they resilient? How have they changed? How aren't they resilient? Another question we can ask then with the historical data is, can we get from, how do we get from current conditions using our understanding of these longer-term dynamics, where we are today, how we, particularly for management purposes and so on. Now, obviously one, point, and I want to make this very clear, is that, in terms of HRV in particular, that, we're not going to recreate the past. That's not the point. Don Falk has an excellent quote about just setting the evolutionary clock ticking again. And I love that quote, just that it's a, all we're trying to do is get it back on the right path, basically. That's the idea with the HRV. Particularly climatological constraints. I mean, in terms of climate change is a huge component of, taking, what we see in the past. Now, I'm going to point out, though, that one of the biggest issues, one of the important components is we're not just reconstructing pattern, but we're also trying to understand process and trying to really develop a longer-term understanding of climate dynamics, successional dynamics, and so on ecosystem timescales, ecological timescales, to really give us some clue, using, for example, modeling techniques and so on, that, okay, given this climate conditions into the future, this might be the pattern we're going to see. Again, we can help, our historical data help in understanding that quite considerably. So right now I'm just going to go through, and this is, again, probably some review for a lot of people, but, in terms of what evidence we can use to reconstruct, obviously fire scars. I mean, everybody knows fire scars. Each one of these little ridges is where fires come along. Now, if fire, kills the cambium all the way around the tree, it girdles the tree, kills the tree. What these fire scars are is where fires come along and injured a portion of the cambium, but not killed the tree entirely. If you want to count, there's 24 scars on that tree, by the way. So what we can do is we can take a cross-section out of this. We love to sample dead trees more than living trees, but you can see these nice, this long-term record of fire in the tree. And typically this is the thing we see is, the last fires in the late 1800s, early 1900s in most of the western U.S., western North America. Everybody's seen cat faces. I mean, I'd just like to point out that, similar age trees right here. They're paleoecological records. It takes a certain amount of temperature and time to actually kill the cambium, but once the tree has one scar on it, then there's a wound wood response on the margins, and that bark then tends to be thinner. So once, and particularly these high frequency ecosystems like Ponderosa pine, or in this case, this is actually Jeffrey pine down in the San Pedro Martir in Baja. Once it's scarred once, then then you get these long-term sequences typically recorded. Stumps in most of the range of Ponderosa in the western U.S. In particular, but Doug fir and so on, there's been a lot of harvest, so stumps are golden for us. It's the second harvest. Sapwood is gone on this guy. Heartwood is still there. We don't know when the tree died, so we'll use cross-dating techniques to then figure out age on it. Just a real quick note, I didn't throw anything on dendrochronology in here, but the whole process of dendrochronology, cross-dating is a basic process we use, and the idea there is that since climate's controlling the growth of the trees, the ring patterns are going to match from tree to tree. So we have to start with living trees, but we can develop a chronology, a library of the ring patterns, and then that way when we go to these dead trees, logs, stumps, snags, again, we have no idea when they died. Sapwood's gone, heartwood's eroded, but we can still get a good sample out of them and still find the dates on them. So, some examples now. I just want to go through these fairly quickly, but these are some, probably some of you are familiar with these. This is a sort of the latest iteration of a kind of a classic one that Tom Swetnam and students have been working on for years, since the late 1980s. Not that far back. But anyway, you can see the time span down here, 1600. So this is a network of about 100 sites right now around Arizona, New Mexico, a couple from northern Mexico as well. And just the number of sites recording fire through time. Notice, like, for example, some years like 1748 and 1851, I mean, 50% of the Southwest was burning. Obviously not one fire, multiple ignitions. Climate driving these. So that's what these are. Up here are a couple of our, what we call superposed epoch analysis graphs. So what we do is we take, so coming back to that previous slide, we also can reconstruct climate, obviously, from our tree ring data. So we have climate independently derived climate reconstructions from our fire chronologies. So what we can do then is compare our fire chronologies to in this example, for example, PDSI reconstruction, Palmer Drought Severity Index. So what we do is we take the average PDSI from all of these fire dates right here, at least 20 sites that recorded fire around the Southwest, and then that's that 0 year right there. So that's the average condition. Drought years, I mean, duh, it's not rocket science. But one thing that we see in a lot of cases is that prior years were wet years. It's fuel build. These are grass. These are fine fuel driven fires. So you get grass fine fuels built up during wet years. You get a good drought year. Boom. That's going to be one of your regional fire years, regional synchronous fire years. And again, just to point out, I mean, we have to do that cross-dating step on all of our data sets, just so we have that temporal resolution to be able to say, I mean, if anyone, you guys heard Jen Pierce's data set yesterday, we got annual resolution. So through our cross-dating process. So we can compare the PDSI and the fire years, and we can know that these are regional fire years. This next one, just to show you, is also Niño 3. That's a sea surface temperature index that's been reconstructed. This is an index of ENSO, El Niño Southern Oscillation. And basically, what we see is that these are also La Niña years, at least in Arizona, New Mexico. La Niña is dry, preceded by El Niño years, wet years. So our super El Nino coming up, probably in the Southwest, we're not going to, and we see exactly opposite. There's fire years down here. This white line, I didn't show it, but is the years when very few fires were recorded around the Southwest. And in those cases, those are mostly El Nino years. So very few fires next year in the Southwest probably, but watch out for the year after if it's an El Nino. A larger data set, now this is just a whole series of chronologies from the Sacramento Mountains in southern New Mexico, the Jemez, up through Colorado and Wyoming, and in the Black Hills in South Dakota. Notice lots and lots of fire. These are mostly Ponderosa, dry mixed conifer, wet mixed conifer forest. There's elevational gradients within any mountain range. So here in the Southwest, for example, every 3 to 5 years at the lower forest border, 15 to 20 years in upper elevation. Black Hills on the order of about every 10 to 12 years in the lower forest border, 20 to 30 to 40 years even at the higher elevations. But lots and lots of fire, at least before the 20th century. Late 1800s comes along, and you can see that, we start losing fires. Of course, that's the question. Coming back to just sort of evidence, I'll talk about that, come back to that point again in a minute, but of course that's, going back to this one, this is the issue we're dealing with. Again, here's our HRV, here's our current conditions in the 20th century, and so where are we with that? But coming to other evidence, of course, like tree recruitment dates in lodgepole pine ecosystems or other ecosystems, obviously we're looking for tree recruitment. A note on that, we sampled lots and lots of trees, hundreds to thousands of trees to really get at the demographic patterns in forests. We core very low on the stem, typically 10 centimeters, to get true tree age when trees established. It's really fairly difficult, actually, just to get that germination date, almost impossible. We're sampling some height above germination. Plus, there's the pith offset. So our protocols call for we'll take multiple cores to try and get as close to pith as we can. Also, just in terms of recruitment dates, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, but, we have other factors. It's not just that trees that post-date stand replacing fires, but also looking at, climate forcing, climate synchronization of recruitment. Tree death dates is another one we can use. The problem with that is that sapwood does tend to decay fairly quickly within a few decades after tree death. So it's very difficult sometimes to, if the tree died 50, 60 years ago, to actually get the death date on the tree. Another one is fire, the mortality factor. So for example, in this tree up here, right away that fire was not, I'm sure everybody in the audience knows that fire was not the mortality factor on this one. Blue stain in the sapwood. And then, of course, tree growth responses. So, suppressions, releases, abrupt suppressions or releases not related to climate, but they're caused by, crown scorch, killing of next-door neighbors, competing trees, those kinds of things. Again, being able to assign the cause is a question on that one. So, This is a study that Stan Kitchen and Emily Heyerdahl and I have done in Utah. It was published, the basic data set was published in GTR a couple of years ago. We still have a lot more analysis to do with this data set, but in this we actually sampled, most of our sites were across an elevational gradient. More and more we're trying to sample age structure in random locations and then look for fire scarred trees to actually get a better idea of sort of, so fire scar implies that it was surface fire, at least at the scale of the individual tree. Now by looking across stands, within a stand we can, have fire dates on multiple trees, so it's surface fire, but also in terms of looking at cohort structure or death dates or other factors like that, releases, we can then start looking at maybe more the changes in severity, the moderate severity, the stand replacing type of severities as well. So that's what we did here. This is on Boulder. So here's Boulder Top actually, 11,000 foot elevation. So spruce up here, going down through mixed conifer, Ponderosa in here, and then into PJ in these lower elevations. So trying to sample across elevational gradients, we have a number of these sites in Utah and in eastern Nevada and the Snakes as well. So sampling both fire scars and tree age structure to really look at this variation in severity and fire sizes and so on. Here's a couple of what these look like. Again, timelines down here at the bottom. Each line is an individual tree. These are 4 different plots, just to give you an idea of some of the patterns we see. So, and what these are, we sampled we're using an in-tree density adapted sampling. It's basically the 30 nearest trees to each plot center. And that way we can have the same number of trees to compare between plots, irrespective of plot of the stand density. If we use fixed plots, we might end up with 2 trees versus 200 trees or something like that. We're sampling just the larger trees, living trees, and in all remnants in the plot, snags, stumps, and logs. So you can see, in this case, all of these are living trees with cores, but then we have some older remnants that we were able to cross-date, and there's a gap in here. None of these are death dates on here because, again, of loss of sapwood. But basically, in these kinds of instances, we will call this, where we get that sort of cohort structure, evidence of crown fire in that plot at one point. Whereas, for example, in this case, we do get a regeneration pulse in here, but we've got these other trees down here that overlap that. None of these plots are over about, half a hectare, 3/4 of half an acre, 3/4 of an acre in size. So they're fairly, tight little areas. It might be evidence of, stand opening from, say, beetle kill or wind throw or some other non-stand replacing event. But we will not call this a stand replacing event. Most of our plots, particularly in Ponderosa pine, but in a lot of other sites, lodgepole, of course, will be very much even age like this. But other ones, are going to be much more multi-aged, and most of the Ponderosa mixed conifer, wet mixed conifer are like that. Just an example, this is actually from Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills. But if we look at, clusters, again, where there's one tree, so the diamonds are tree recruitment dates, and then the triangles are fire scar dates. And you can see, just lots and lots of fire. These were all the fires that occurred at Mount Rushmore. Basically, looking at this, we did a paper on this one, about 3% of the landscape from 1556 out to 1893. We estimate about 3% of the fires during that time were crown fires. Rest were surface fires. So some of you probably know I cannot stand the term mixed severity fire because there's no scale associated with it. So we've had people say, well, there was mixed severity fire in the past, there's mixed severity fire today. What's the problem? Well, the scale of the amount of crown mortality is the issue. So we have other pulses, of course, that are, there's plenty of trees in this plot and a whole bunch that came in at that point. One thing too, there was a paper by Shinneman and Baker back in 1997 that argued for huge crown fires in the Black Hills because of even age forest structure. Well, when you look at, this is about 1,000 trees I've sampled across the Black Hills, very cohorty structure, but a lot of trees relate to precipitation events, to wet events. So climate driving regeneration dynamics. So, and I'd just like to point out too, just these are a couple of pictures of the Hayman fire that burned in 2002, the Buffalo Creek fire on the Front Range in 1996. We're not getting any regeneration from any of these. Jen Pierce's talk yesterday, we need to be very, very, very careful in talking about severity versus size in terms of reconstructing some of these events. She, in her data sets, they have evidence for high severity patches. We have evidence for high severity patches. But the patches, for example, we did a fire history in the Hayman landscape, this Cheeseman Reservoir on the South Platte River, down by the Cheeseman Reservoir area, and the patches that we reconstructed of high severity fire were on the order of hectares to maybe 200 hectares or so. We had dead trees, we were able to date them. They dated to 1851. 1851 burned in this area as well, and here in Colorado as well as in the Southwest. Hayman, there was this area of crown mortality in Hayman was probably somewhere in the order of 60,000 acres. So we're talking orders of magnitude difference in crown mortality today. Let's also think about the regeneration dynamics of Ponderosa pine. Ponderosa has it's got a wing on it, but it's a fairly fat, heavy seed. Paula Fornwalt, just a student of hers, just did a study in Hayman. And regeneration here in Hayman, 10 years, 12, 13 years after Hayman, is pretty much nil. So when we lose a seed source across these kinds of landscapes, we've got a type change for quite some time, at least in the Front Range. Buffalo Creek in 96, extremely little regeneration, and that's only on the fringes where the unburned forest was. So these arguments about, well, mixed severity fire occurred in the past, mixed severity fires occurring in current forests, current fires, are completely bogus, absolutely bogus, because if they don't mention scale, don't listen to them, don't pay any attention to them. So, and don't get me started on that. So. Just a real quick, I want to just run through another example, and I'll have to rush through this one, but this is from Archuleta Mesa, but just the type of data sets that we're developing on this one. I'll run through this. This is kind of a complicated picture. We've got INSO reconstruction up here, drought reconstructions here, fire dates, again, the same thing, time spans of individual trees with the fire scars marked. Ponderosa pine recruitment on this, it's about a 500 acre or 550 acre area. And in non-Ponderosa recruitment, PJ, there's some PJ, and then there's also Doug fir up there. But basically, just to run through this, very few trees predate, in all Ponderosa, this 1580s mega drought. It's about a 20-year long drought. Tom Swetnam and I published a paper years ago on it's easy to find trees that established in the early 1600s, and notice there's a pretty good pluvial in the early 1600s. A lot of trees established during that, but hard to find trees predating that 1580s megadrought. Then we actually get Ponderosa, 2 pulses of Ponderosa recruitment during these longer intervals between fires. About 11 years, if we exclude these 2 gaps from 1684 to 1724 and 1818 to 1851, if we exclude those 2, the average fire interval was about 11 years. What's going on is that during, most of the time, these frequent surface fires are killing regeneration. That's the whole point of these surface fires, is that you limit your ability to stand regeneration. Now, during those longer intervals, more trees were able to reach a sapling status that when that next fire came along, then they were killed by that next fire. If we look then also, next thing is we wanted to look at the climate of those fire years. So again, these are the superposed epoch analysis. So we have annual precipitation, again, dry during the fire years, wet previous, wet, dry combos, fuel buildup, fuel drying. INSO, El Nino, this is a Southern Oscillation Index, another index of El Nino, and it's reversed. So El Ninos are down, La Ninas are up. So El Nino wet, La Nina dry. If we look at SOI now, what we see is that actually that SOI, so all of these triangles are this significant pattern of wet-dry combo marked on the drought year with the triangles here. SOI is reversed, the SOI reconstruction, but you can see that during these two periods, that basically this wet-dry oscillation was modulated, at least in this area. And we found that another, this early 1800s gap is all over the Southwest, basically. So, and then finally, the last thing on this one is just that the last fire date we see is 1871 in this stand, and then a whole pulse of recruitment that comes in after that. That's the pattern we're seeing all over the place. So. And then the last example I just want to throw out here is, I'll spend some time on this one, but this is the one that we've been working on in the Front Range. Front Range Forest, the Front Range Forest Reconstruction Network. I'd like to very much acknowledge my co-PIs on this, Mike Battaglia, Paula Fornwalt, and Lori Huckabee at the Rocky Mountain Station in Fort Collins. Tony Chang with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at CSU, Colorado State. It's our funding agencies, and then we've been sampling in landscapes, study areas up and down the Front Range. We've put in 179 half-hectare plots, and just to show you, we've got almost 11,000 dates of trees that we've sampled, and an inventory other ones. We've had some huge, I know you guys have been showing, yesterday was a number of photos of sagebrush, the sage fires. Well, we've had a bunch on the Front Range the last few years as well. Hayman, this big one down here, High Park just occurred up near Fort Collins recently. Black Forest, of course, Lower North Fork, which was actually an escaped state forest, was burning piles. That got out of hand, killed a couple of people, 3 people, so on. Anyway, the Front Range Roundtable, and this is another thing that the Monroe Mountain Working Group, we've got a really good collaborative that's gotten started on the Front Range, working with the Pike, San Isabel, and Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest. And this Front Range Fuels Treatment Roundtable was the original name. It's now the Front Range Roundtable, and actually we're going to change the name again, we think, just because Roundtable doesn't really convey anything. This publication was, so it got started after 2002, Hayman. In 2006, there was this document published that was sort of a consensus document. One thing I'd like to point out is our collaboration has extremely few disagreements. Everyone is pretty much on the same page with what needs to be done. One thing, of course, this shows the National Forest, but this is also the WUI, a lot of development going on in the Front Range, obviously. 2010, we got this CFLR project funded as well. So we have a very active landscape restoration team that is working on this. We started with developing a monitoring plan, which is part of the CFLR Act. That's one of the neat things about this one is it does call for a lot of monitoring. So we developed the monitoring plan, and we realized we really didn't have any understanding of historical stand structure, and that's where this Front Range Forest Reconstruction Network got started and got funded. One of the things was that we didn't want this. We knew, there's a lot of the fuel treatment going on where, it's a thin from below, spacing-based types of treatments. Richard Reynolds calls this, the jail bar look. We don't want that. So, plantation look. This, GTR 310 just came out. It's been incredibly influential for a lot of our thinking on the Front Range, but thinking about, much more of an ecosystem perspective in terms of restoration, more natural openings, larger openings, groups, individual trees, lots of grass, herb, understory spacing in between. So this has been very influential for us. We are actually working on a GTR of our own. So what we wanted to do is actually try and reconstruct spatial as well as non-spatial structural conditions. So trees per acre, but also basal area, but then also how many trees were in groups, how many trees, what was the percentage of openings, and how big. We don't have with a half hectare, so this is a half hectare right here. This is our study design. All we can tell is spatial patterning at the half hectare scale, but how many stands were grouped, how many stands were, so on, what kind of spacing we were getting. So basically, this is our just bottom design, basic design for the study. We stem map all of our pre-settlement trees over the whole half hectare. We're calling pre-settlement anything over 25 centimeters, but then it has to have old growth characteristics, old tree characteristics for it. So, bark coloration, canopy structure, and so on. And any remnants. 97% of our plots, I want to point out, we've been doing random sampling. We put out random points and we go. 97% of our plots have had stumps in them. So stumps, nice tall straight growing trees, and they're right there above those rapidly growing cities of Denver and Boulder and Golden and so on. So, and then we collect, we set up these 4 500 square meter subplots that we actually core or section everything in there. So that's where we're getting our age structure. We're actually estimating our non-spatial structure from those 4 subplots. So we know exactly which trees were present in 1860. 1860 is our target date. And by the way, we realize this is just a single date. We're getting just a snapshot in time, but at least some idea of what was present in 1860 in these stands. We know exactly which trees were there in 1860, and we can pretty much measure, on the tree or estimate how big the tree was for calculating BAs. So, for example, here's a plot where and then I forgot to mention we sample all fire scar data as well that we see both within the plot and then surrounding the plots. We'll search around the plots as well. In some cases, it's pretty easy to see which are the pre-settlement trees. And again, stumps, are very common in these. We just had a paper, in fact, I think it came out online, or actually in the journal yesterday in CJFR. But this is our first study we did on Boulder County parks and open space. And we just put in a bunch of random points, and then we would pick, just go, and if it worked, basically we were just looking for someplace with a half hectare that we could put in the plot that was on a, didn't change slope or aspect all that much. We'd put in the plot. So this is what the plots look like. Again, the bars are regeneration. Remnant trees are red, so again, most of the remnants were stumps. Green then are our cores that we collected, and again, we just collected anything over 25 centimeters for the, and then we have all these fire scar dates too. So just a little bit on the fire intervals, so you can see, fairly frequent fire, 8 to 15 years depending upon the scale of analysis. Last fire, the last spreading fire, we had 1867 recorded in one stand, but 1859 was the last spreading fire recorded in more than one stand across the landscape. Some of our non-spatial and spatial stand structures, basically in terms of spatial, about 70% of the trees were found in groups. They were in a clump of at least 2 trees. But you can see some of the numbers here in terms of, and again, what we're really focusing the managers on is not going to be so much the mean of, say BAs of, 30 square feet per acre, but the range. And all of the stands we sampled are today forested, but we did have one where we couldn't find any pre-settlement trees in it, but up to around 80. So, anywhere probably, from 10 to 80 BA. And it's the distribution of those BAs across the landscape, and that's what we'll be developing with this 179 plots that we have as well. And then these are the stem maps, just to the pre-settlement ones. So we've got random distribution in some. This was our densest plot up here, the one that had 134 trees per acre. And then also group distributions on some of the other ones. So we can using spatial stats find out which are grouped, which are clumped, how many trees in groups, so on like that. So This is from this GTR that we're working on as well, and this is just sort of a conceptual model of thinking about, in terms of dispersion versus density. Today we have a lot of our stands over here on this side of the diagram, and basically what we're hoping is, we realize we're never going to get rid of all of these, but we want to even out the distribution of these cookies, as we're calling them, across the landscape. And so we want to get much more back over on this side of the scale, and particularly getting from this corner down more to this corner is what we hope. Plus openings. We know that, we want to create, get more openings. So a couple of examples of just recent projects on the Front Range. This is the Long John project that down near Woodland Park. Messenger Gulch cut. So again, these data, as we're starting, even before we get it published, it's still being used. Again, the landscape restoration team has been very, very involved in a lot of this, and the collaboration with Forest Service. I have to say Forest Service has been, folks we work with on both the Pike and the AR are absolutely wonderful. We've had some really good working relationships with them. We're hoping, this is the next thing, of course, is we're hoping to get some burning back into some of these ecosystems. We're dealing with smoke management issues, obviously, and WUI issues on the Front Range in particular, but, I love that cartoon right there. So, again, process. We got to understand the process. It's not just the pattern, but we've got, and this is one thing for, particularly restoration is maintenance. We're going to do these mechanical treatments, but boy, in fact, just going back to this one, I don't know if you can see, but I just was wandering through here a month or so ago, and we're getting a lot of regen already in that area. So we're going to be right back into, and I forgot to mention, we do have, numbers for current stand structure, and, orders of magnitude more trees today in many of these locations. So there was a lot of trees that were removed from that one stand up there. So finally, the last slide, but just, thinking historical data really, this historical range of variability, we're not only just reconstructing patterns, but we're also really addressing some of these basic questions about processes. And I'm trying to understand how processes are affecting pattern, how that's changed in current forests, and how we can go forward into the future. One final quote I love is this one from a very old paper, but when time is required for an experiment, and that's what we should be treating our treatments as, there's no substitute for history. So, thank you.
And we do have time for a couple of questions.
It's break time. Everybody's ready for break. Bob.
So in restoration, though, one of the big things to look forward in the future, especially with climate change, is creating the resilient forests. So are your treatments also addressing the fact that you're going to minimize future mortalities when the next big fire strikes? In other words, are you incorporating that into your plans?
That's what we're, fire resilience is the biggest thing. And also, just the other thing that's going on in the Front Range, or has been, and it's kind of stopped at this point, was mountain pine beetle outbreaks and so on. And also, I'd just like to point out, just coming to that, anyway, to answer your question, yes, we're really trying to fire management. One point I forgot to make was in terms of higher elevation forests that do have longer intervals. One of the points that a lot of people have made is, well, we really haven't changed at a stand scale. Fire exclusion, fire suppression's not had an impact in some of the subalpine ecosystems, whitebark ecosystems, where they were longer intervals in the first place. One of the questions I have, though, is what about the landscape scale? And this comes down to the fact that, well, we have been putting out fires in the subalpine over the last 100, 110 years. And the issue there is that, well, particularly for mountain pine beetle or bark beetles in general, is that how much have we changed that landscape dynamic that, okay, now habitat is suitable all over the place, whereas in the past, yeah, you'd have suitable habitat on this mountainside or something, but this valley would have burned 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and that habitat is not suitable for the beetles to cross that. Now everything is grown up, that's all now 150 years, it's 250 years old, and that suitable habitat is everywhere. So I question, that we have affected habitat, fire exclusion has had an impact in even the subalpine and PJA ecosystems, the higher and lower elevations.
One more back there.
In the treatments, you guys find the ground cover, basal stratum, residual component there that comes back on its own, or does that also need years? Or
So the question was, are we seeing anything, understory responses, and what are we looking at? That's part of our monitoring program, and right now actually the understory monitoring, we set up the monitoring plan back in 2011. That got published as a Colorado Forest Restoration Institute publication. And we've had sub-teams that have been working on both wildlife monitoring and understory monitoring. This year is going to be our first year that we actually have some understory data to actually look at. But that's a great question, and we're part of our desired conditions that we've set up is that there will be an understory response for sure.
Thank you.